All right, guys, just get it all out of your system.
Hello. Hi.
All right, hello, everyone. I hope that you're all safe, healthy, and more importantly, if you can, are staying at home. Welcome to my dining room, which for the next few months, and hopefully only the next few months, will act as our Wilson Institute offices. My new coworkers are loud, although they were oddly enough, not very loud right now, and require so many snacks. So many snacks, it's unbelievable how much they eat. Now, the last few weeks at home have definitely been interesting. I won't lie. As a very social person, this has been very hard. My kids think I'm an idiot, and I'm absolutely failing as their new educator. K-12 educators are heroes. I also vow never to wait before getting a haircut. My hat can barely contain what's growing at a ridiculous pace on my head. I mean, look at this. It's like it knows that I can't get a haircut. Like, can hair become self-aware? So today I'd like to introduce you all to our new Wilson Institute Speaker Series, Self-Isolation Edition. The aim really is to do our small part, very small part, to break the monotony of self-isolation and to try to provide a sense of normalcy to our day-to-day lives. More importantly, if like me, the barrage of COVID-19 articles makes you super anxious, hopefully this speaker series will help you forget about the current stressful events, even if it's only for a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds. So how are these going to work? Essentially, we want these talks to be fairly casual and about 15 to 18 minutes long. You can talk about a specific project you're working on, research in progress, any element of Canadian history that we may not be aware of, a recent publication, or really anything that's on your mind. If you want to talk about the ridiculous things that your kids are watching on TV, go ahead. But just make sure you put it in a historical context. Then with our tech guy, Colin, we'll turn these talks into cool videos with images and everything, really make them, like Ken Burns documentary style videos. That's putting a lot of pressure on Colin, I know. I'll provide each video with an introductory remark on our guest speaker, and then ideally we'd upload them at the same time each week and conduct an online Q&A session on our Facebook and Twitter pages for maybe the following 30 minutes. So basically, ideally, we all decide on Friday, 1:30, we upload the video, we watch it together, and then 20 minutes later, we meet up on our Facebook and Twitter pages and then have a Q&A session with a speaker. Sounds good? All right, so if you want to give a talk, email me at dagenam@mcmaster.ca, and then we can get started. So today, I'd like to provide the first talk, not because I like to hear myself talk, but because Colin and I need to figure this stuff out. We need to work out the kinks, we need to figure out what we're doing, and we basically just need to have a trial run to make sure that this works as well as we're imagining it to work. I'll talk about something that may surprise a few historians, and that is the connection between the American South, slavery in the United States, and the Canadian Rebellion of 1837-38. This is research that I was working on when I was a postdoc at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, and that I had to put on hold when I became an administrator. I just quite simply at the moment don't have the time nor the research funds to conduct this research. But before we get to that, let's have a wee refresher on the rebellion. I'm sure for most of you this will be extremely familiar since you've all taken Intro to Canada classes, but very quickly, let's go. So in the late 18th, early 19th century, all over the Atlantic world, people were fighting to end monarchical institutions and establish more representative democratic and republican governments, most notably with the French and American revolutions. This is known as the Age of Revolutions or the Atlantic Revolutions. Now, settlers in Canada were extremely influenced by this and began pushing for their own reform. I'm sure you've heard the words reformers and patriotes. And basically the reformers were the reformers of Upper Canada, patriotes were the reformers of Lower Canada. And in both colonies, reformers and patriots saw their push for reform blocked by the Governor General and his loyal elite who fought to retain their privileged position. Now, in the mid-1830s, after years of having their push for reform blocked, the patriots in Lower Canada gave the British an ultimatum. Grant the colony democratic institutions, or the population would revolt, just like Americans had done. This is known as the 92 resolutions. When the British refused, this convinces many that reforming the colony could never happen through peaceful means. Rebellion was the only option, and in both colonies, reformers took up arms, and as we all know, unfortunately for the reformers and the Patriotes, the rebellion does not end well. The British are quite simply too well equipped, too numerous to be defeated. Now, this is all fairly well known to everyone, right? So you must be asking yourselves, what does this have to do with the South and slavery? Well, this is where things start to get really interesting from a historical perspective. Now, in the aftermath of these defeats, rebel leaders escaped to the United States and sought support from the American population. Now, though President Martin Van Buren was officially unwilling to help, declaring the neutrality of the United States, the rebels did gain the support of many, many locals. And in fact, in the northern states, from Maine to Ohio, Vermont to Pennsylvania, locals supported the rebels, equating rebel leaders like Mackenzie and Papineau with the heroes of 1776. Individuals like Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, George Washington. The Canadians, they argued, Americans argued, were fighting for something just, their freedom. And Americans living in the North expressed sympathy for something that they called the Canadian Revolution. Many even joined secret societies known as the Hunters' Lodges to liberate the Canadian colonies from, and I quote, British thraldom. Now, all of this is also fairly well known to historians of the rebellion. However, what is not as well known is that the American South, so places like the Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, was equally invested in the outcome of the rebellion. And this was due to one specific reason: slavery. You see, by the time the reformers and the Patriots took up arms in November 1837, the United States was a very, very divided nation. And what divided them more than anything else? Slavery. And this is something that was made very clear to me when I first arrived at the McNeil Center. As a historian whose work focused on the northern Canada-US borderland, and more specifically on a region known as Madawaska, slavery was really not my primary focus of research. One day, however, after presenting a paper at the McNeil Center where I kind of discussed the rebellion and the impact of the economic crisis of 1837 in the U.S., the Panic of 1837, and the American-British diplomacy, one of my colleagues came up to me at the end of my talk and straight up said, "Max, everything in the U.S. at the time has to do with slavery. The rebellion, your rebellion that you're looking at, was no exception." And boy, was she right. And in the next few months, as I began my research, references to slavery kept coming up in documents discussing the rebellion. So as I said, by November 1837, the United States was extremely divided. Specifically, there was a delicate balance of power between slave states and free states, with 13 states on each side. I meant to say 13. I do have to maintain my Franco, persona. And both sides feared what the addition of either a slave or free state would do to that delicate balance of power. Now, the creation of a Republic of Texas, or of the Republic of Texas, following the Texas Revolution of 1836, had already caused quite a fuss in the North, as abolitionists condemned the South's aim to annex the slave state. Now, the potential creation of two independent and free Canadian republics up north created an equal fuss in the South. Slaveholders feared what the addition of a free state or two to the United States would do to this fragile balance of power. And yes, before anyone asks me, the Patriots and the Reformers wanted to separate and initially join the United States. If you want more information on this, my good friend Julien Mauduit has an article coming up on the topic with Early American Studies, which I think is scheduled for this summer. So really, it's a brilliant article, and it'll answer all your questions about the issue of independence and annexation. So the rebellion, or more specifically, the potential for the creation of Canadian republics, became an important factor in this battle. And to Southerners, what was happening along the border with Canada, so basically all of these Americans, all of these Northerners joining these hunters' lodges and pledging to free and liberate Canada from Britain was nothing more than an abolitionist ploy to harm the South. They feared that Northern abolitionists were helping the rebels not because they believed in Canadian freedom, but merely as a ploy to put the slave states in a minority position. So, throughout 1838, Southerners, or at least what we see in the archives, heavily condemned the rebellion, the rebels, and every Northerner that came to their aid. Southern newspapers with ties to slaveholding interests were especially vicious. Newspapers like the Charleston Mercury and the Southern Patriot, both from South Carolina, were absolutely brutal and ruthless when it came to the rebellion. Both used extremely negative language when discussing the rebellion and their Northern supporters. The Southern Patriot called the Canadian Rebellion and rebels and supporters as evil, and even described their actions as rash and treason. The Charleston Mercury, on the other hand, used terms such as butchery, gruesome, ill-judged, vile, villainous, pirates, enemy, scum, unlawful, to describe the event. Now, the response to the Caroline Affair is also very revealing. Now, for those of you who don't know, who are unfamiliar with the Caroline Affair, the affair took place in late December 1837 when a group of British loyalists crossed the Niagara River into American territory and captured and destroyed an American ship, the Caroline, that was rumored to be helping the rebels. Now, both newspapers blamed the Caroline Affair not on the British assailants, but on the Americans themselves. The northern borderland population, they claimed, had violated the peace between the two nations. Southern newspapers even absolved Britain of all blame, even siding with it, stating that there are, and I quote, some severe charges against the conduct of our citizens, which we have great reason to believe are well-founded. They, the British, make out a very strong case against the boat, that she was armed, that she had been the vehicle of the arms, and other military supplies which our citizens forwarded from time to Navy Island, which is where the reformers had set up shop after the defeats in New York. Now, the Charleston Mercury and the Southern Patriot were so opposed to the Canadian Rebellion that they even adopted a completely contradictory position with regards to American foreign policy. Now, as I mentioned, Upper and Lower Canadians were not the only ones who rebelled along the American border in the second half of the 1830s. In 1835-1836, Americans living in Texas, a Mexican province at the time, and the Tejanos, Spanish settlers living in Texas, rebelled against a Mexican government that was increasingly centralizing authority around a unitary regime in Mexico. Now, though officially at peace with Mexico, Southerners loudly supported the Texas Revolution. They supplied Texans with arms and ammunition, and even actively participated in it. Both newspapers spoke very positively about the Texans and used very different language when discussing the Texas Revolution, using words like heroes and valiant. To the Charleston Mercury, Texas independence was, and I quote, glorious news for the South, explaining that because Texas was settled by slaveholders and had become a slave state, an independent Texas, or one that was part of the United States, would help, and I quote, ensure the stability of Southern institutions. However, a few years later, when the Patriots and the Reformers rebelled, Southern newspapers insisted on the neutrality of the United States and even pushed the federal government to send a military force to the Canadian border to prevent local interference. They even argued that the Canadian rebellion was quite simply unwarranted. The Canadians were rebelling against a, and I quote, a long-established, a peaceful, and a liberal government. In comparison, the Texans were fighting against, and I quote, despotism, bigotry, and barbarism, and for the spread of civilization and pure republican institutions. So, why did these two newspapers treat so drastically differently the Texas Revolution and the Canadian Rebellion? Why was one a just event led by valiant heroes fighting for liberty and pure Republican institutions, and the other an unjust event led by evil criminals, pirates, against a just and peaceful government? Why did they implore the U.S. government to remain neutral and prevent American involvement for one, but encouraged American intervention for the other? Now, although racial prejudice, yes, Americans viewed Mexicans with much derision and Britons with kinship, may explain why both newspapers and the South treated the uprisings differently. And this is something I discussed in a previous article on the topic with American Review of Canadian Studies. There is another possibility, and this is the one I mentioned at the beginning of my talk: slavery. While the inclusion of one state, Texas, would help the position of slavery in the United States, the inclusion of the other or others, the Canadas, would harm it. Now, Southern newspapers knew this, and as a result, they began attacking Northern sympathizers for using the rebellion as a ploy to harm the South and her institutions. And by institutions, obviously they mean slavery. They even argued that Northerners were not doing this to help the Canadians, but quite simply to counter the potential annexation of Texas. The Charleston Mercury stated, and I quote, "It is said that the struggle of Texas has a connection with the Canada Rebellion. The comparison is not made for the purpose of benefiting Canada, but of injuring Texas. Those who are opposed to the union with the state are most happy to seize upon every scum," referring to the Canadian Rebellion and the Canadian rebels, "that floats on the stream of events." The newspaper added that the Northerners opposed the independence of Texas, not because of a love of Mexico, but for their opposition of the South and its institutions. And here's another quote: "Nay, some of them, now themselves lovers of Mexico, some warm advocates of all of her insolent claims, apologists of her outrages, and would have their own country and its flag disgraced by the tame and cowardly submission to the wrong insults of their worthy Mexican allies in the warfare against the prosperity and influence of the southern states of this union. No means are too vile, no instrument too villainous, no alliance too degrading in a crusade in aiming at the great end of which the trampling down of the South and her institutions, these philanthropical Free State crusaders see their only consistency." And what were these institutions that had caused so much strife in the United States and that the North wanted to trample down? Slavery. And those Southern newspapers shied away from using the word slavery in their articles. Several Northern newspapers did not, citing slavery as the true cause of conflict between supporters and opponents of the Canadian Rebellion and the Texas Revolution. Now, according to the Carlisle Herald, and I quote, and this is a really juicy quote, "President Martin Van Buren has issued his proclamation in reference to the existing state of things in Canada, forbidding all interference on the part of the citizens of the United States. But how come it that in the case of Mexico and Texas, that a different course is pursued? There was no proclamation forbidding our interference then? Oh no, why this difference? It is a dark spirit of slavery which has made the difference. Canada is the resting place of him whose color is made a curse to him, while Texas only straightens the chain by which he is bound down in cruel oppression. On behalf of the latter, Texas, all of our sympathies at the beck and nod of the South are to be made to flow, and we are required to do our bidding, admit Texas into the Union, and thereby perpetuate slavery in this land, which has been styled the home of the free." Now, one of the things that's so amazing and interesting about this quote is that it suggests that slaveholding interests may have actually influenced or pushed Martin Van Buren's official response, stating that it was the dark spirit of slavery that guided his decision to declare neutrality and prevent Americans from assisting the Canadians. But was this the case? Was the opposition of the slaveholders strong enough to guide American foreign policy? Could slaveholding interests in Washington have been important enough to push the federal government to adopt an official position of neutrality and prevent Americans from aiding the Canadian rebels and thereby essentially ensuring its defeat? Yes, or it appears so. We don't have all the evidence yet. It's something I'm working on at the moment, or hopefully in the future. Now, the notion that slaveholding interests influenced American domestic and foreign policy is nothing new. Even Karl Marx noted this back in the 19th century. More recently, however, historian Matthew Carr pointed out in his brilliant Slaveholders at the Helm of American Foreign Policy that between 1833 and 1861, slaveholding Southerners guided American foreign policy. These men practiced what he calls a, and I quote, foreign policy of slavery, and got involved in several international struggles to defend slavery and the slave state in places like Brazil, Cuba, Texas, etc. Since these men dominated the executive branch of the federal government during this period, they made sure that American diplomacy was guided by the needs of the slaveholding South. Now, as I said, although much research needs to be done to fully demonstrate this, there's every reason to believe that, like Cuba, like Brazil, like Texas, the Canadas would have been of equal concern to slaveholding Southerners. Anything that could harm the survival of slavery in the United States or abroad, such as the addition of 2 independent and free republics to the north, needed to be dealt with promptly, which explains why they were so opposed to the rebellion. So that's it. This is the kind of thing that we're looking for. If you do want to give a talk, please email me. Between 15, 18, maybe 20 minutes. It'll be a great way to stay in touch and to essentially, try to keep our minds off what's happening outside. So stay safe, and we'll get through this together. Bye.